Okay, welcome everyone. Tonight we are going to be talking about backup offers and extensions, which when we're like on August, we're only a few days into the month, that has been kind of the theme of the week of just making sure that everybody gets their backups in or they get their offers or their extensions done with their pending contracts. So tonight I'm going to go through some pitfalls, some strategies, and also give you guys some language on how to write these backup offers. We're going to talk the first part of the call very briefly, about 10 minutes, I would say, on backup offers and some good ideas you might want to try if you have not received acceptance on something and you're really trying to come up with some creative ways to get your clients a house or a property. That might be some good things you could take away. And then the bulk of the call will be spending on extensions, on how to properly write the extension, what to say, how to use the terminology, and some considerations that you might want to also take note of. So that's what tonight looks like. Again, it'll be a 30-minute. We'll be done at 6 o'clock for those of you that have to run and do something else. And again, if you have questions, if you're new to the webinar series, you can send me a note and we will look at the notes at the very end. Or if you do need to speak, if you can't see a visual, let us know and we will try to assist you in that way. So let's just jump right in. 38A is the backup offer addendum. So this is an addendum that you would use to the purchase and sale agreement. Before I kind of go through what this is, what the strategy would be is, hey, I'm running into a lot of offers that are in maybe pending status. I got a call yesterday from a lady, I think it was in Seattle, and she was asking me about my listing that was pending and asking if it would be possible for her to write a backup. And it was interesting because a lot of you don't realize that you actually, when you change the status, you don't have to get permission. You don't have to ask the seller for permission. You can change your status in the MLS. When you go from active to pending, you could automatically go from active to pending backup. You do not require any kind of notification. It's just that the seller may entertain a backup offer. I think a lot of people think they have to get proper permission or anything like that. You can go strictly to pending backup. I sometimes don't, but in today's market where you might get a better backup offer than maybe the one you accepted initially, it might be smart. I could definitely see the strategy by changing it right from active to pending backup at this time when the inventory is super, super low and it's not expected to get any better. We are still seeing inventory challenges across the board. We're seeing inventory challenges in the Kitsap. We're seeing inventory challenges even in Spokane. So all the areas that we service are having challenges. So the strategy would be, start trolling if you are looking for a specific property in a particular area. We are seeing a rise of pendings going back to active. And so you might be able to slip in if you were to call. For example, I had a guy looking in a specific condo complex, and he had to be in that complex, and it was a 55 plus community. I could simply contact, if nothing was active for him to see, I could contact those 3 pendings that are in there and see how solid they were. And if they were not, the agent was like, we're not past appraisal, we're not past financing, we're not past inspection, and we're like a week away from closing. What I would do, my strategy would be to go ahead and let her know that I have a ready, willing, and able buyer. And I would write up an offer. It'd have to be a very strong offer, maybe even a bit above the asking price, especially if she got multiple offers, and write up the purchase and sale agreement, including the 38A. That would be in the addenda line. And then if she wants to get me into backup position, then that would benefit my buyer, because instead of her going back to active on the market, remarketing, putting a lot of emphasis, open houses, doing whatever that she needs to do to get that properly sold again, she already has a backup, and she can use that as leverage as well. So if, for example, that buyer fails appraisal, challenges on the appraisal contingency, or the lender delays and getting the deal submitted to escrow, which is happening a lot right now with people losing their jobs, or they're not able to come up with the income, or they have problems where they have to put mom or dad on the loan, and that doesn't come together. if there's any delay, that backup gets put right into position most of the time. So it's a good, strong idea to write a 38A. I talked with the top producer on my Edgewood listing. She was doing the same thing. She was calling the pendings. And I asked her point blank, I said, are you doing this a lot? She goes, Rochelle, my broker and my team, they are really helping our brokers in, I think she was at Coldwell Banker, understanding what that 38A will do. And she's like, I'm calling all of them in Edgewood because my client has to be in that school district, wants to be in that school area. And she's like, and there's nothing on the market, nothing under 550. So again, this is a strategy that many brokers are using right now because they're realizing that, yes, you might get quick multiple offers, get a buyer under contract, but then what you'll find is that that property, the chance of that property going back to market is pretty high with the challenges that people are having with their financing, or with buyers getting cold feet, or with buyers asking for tons of repairs in a seller, a challenge inventory, or a seller's market, quite frankly. So definitely think about how you incorporate 38A. If again, you're running into roadblocks where you just can't find the property for a client, you might want to call some of those listing agents that have pending properties. And even though they don't say pending backup, they may be interested in seeing an offer that's very strong using a 38A. And that's what I'll say about that. Next slide. So the way you would write it, purchase and sale agreement, you could, this was a purchase and sale agreement that was written that was not done correctly. So I had to put pursuant to Form 36 and 39. Where it says pursuant to Form 36 and 39, let's say you wrote an offer, or the agent wrote an offer and you already are pending, just make sure that the 38A is one of the addenda that's listed in line number 16. Make sure it's one of the drop-down options if you're using a backup, or you counter and make sure that the backup is part of it. You don't want to sell the home twice. That's the concern that many of you have is, you know, I don't want to accept this offer when I already am pending with another. The way you do that is you make the Form 38A part of the purchase and sale agreement. Either put it in your counter offer or make sure it's in line number 16 under the addenda. So that's what you would do. And that also is the language you would use for countering for many of you who are not using the 36, which is a counter offer addendum. Just a quick reminder, you should probably write pursuant to Form 36 right above the signature line. And that is compliant with the state law. You can use that as a way to keep it normal. So in 38B, that is the backup addendum notice. So let's just say in that instance where I was in a condo and there's multiple offers and I called a pending backup and they said, no problem, yes, go ahead and write me a good offer. We went above asking, we didn't ask for any closing costs. For some reason, the other buyer backed out. Then the seller would then send me a 38B, which is the backup addendum notice. The seller would basically, pursuant to backup paragraph 3, that seller gives notice to buyer that the first sale failed to close, which would be the first sale. And then the backup agreement is now a firm agreement for the first sale of the property. So this 38B is used by listing agents to communicate that they are in position, that you're going to start your timelines and you're going to proceed as instructed on the addendum. If your buyer changes their mind and maybe they wrote a backup addendum and they found something in the midst of time, they could also send this. This would also be used for a buyer's agent notice to communicate with the seller that, hey, my buyer's out. They decided to go and find another property. They didn't want to wait their time. And so the seller has not delivered the first notice. And so buyer hereby agrees to terminate this agreement. So the 38B can be used to communicate whether a seller is going to make the buyer put in first position, or make the buyer, or if the buyer's agent's wanting to let the seller know that, hey, we're out, we haven't got notice, but we decided to find a different direction. So our backup is not on the table anymore. That's what that means. So hopefully that gives you guys some ideas on how to use 38A and B, but we are seeing a rise in this. And again, the strategy would be to contact those listing agents. If you guys just joined us, contact those listing agents that have properties that are in pending status. Many brokers, in fact, I would say 90% of the listing agents, when they change the status from active to pending, they don't change it to active pending backup, pending BU. They just go straight to pending. That doesn't necessarily mean they wouldn't welcome a phone call from you, a Best Choice Realty agent who has been trained on how to write a very solid, good backup offer. And the chances are a lot higher than they were in other times where they may consider and put you right into position, which would be the 38B. So that's the recap on the 38A and B. Next slide. Extensions. So we're going to talk about extensions. Who initiates the extension? We're going to talk about the on or before language, and then things to keep in mind that were pitfalls, especially if you don't do a lot of transactions. There are a lot of challenges that we're seeing right now with financing, and extensions are on the rise. We're seeing probably, I would say 30 to 40% of the deals really are having to get extensions done, and it's because of delays in financing or in delays in appraisals not coming in at value, and we're having to get through and challenge the appraisal. That is the reason why we are seeing a rise of 22Ys. But there are ways that you want to handle a 22Y. So first off, I want to get you out of, if you've been practicing this way, it's not bad, but there is an addendum for an extension. So I would get away from doing your extensions on a Form 34. Just stop it. Don't do it anymore. There are too many Form 34s that get exchanged between the parties. And the MLS several years ago, back in 2017, but even before that, they had created a 22Y, which is the modification of the closing date addendum. This can be used either to modify it either earlier or later. So really there's no need for a Form 34 to say your extension is, the purchase and sale agreement has been extended. A lot of the older brokers used to use a Form 34 in that manner. So if you get an extension like that and you're representing the other party, just kind of laugh and shrug it off that they may not have been trained. But there is an addendum, there is a 22Y for the very purpose of changing the closing date. And this is the recommendation that I would use. Now, I'll give you my philosophy whenever you're extending a contract. I mean, I understand if you need a few days of an extension. And most of the time, my sellers understand that as well, unless there's some really hard to work with sellers. Most of the sellers are very reasonable, and they understand that there's delays that happen that are kind of outside of the party's control. So when somebody proposes a 22Y with me initially, I don't usually put the conversion of the earnest money into a non-refundable. I don't usually write that. You can just usually use number 1 and then put that date. And again, that's kind of my philosophy. If it's just a few days and we just have to amend the closing date, no problem. When it becomes one extension leads to a second extension or a third extension, that's when you want to start representing the parties and making sure that your seller is properly protected. So this language that you see in line 3, which is kind of hard to read if you're looking on a small screen like mine, that language is meant to be a way to hold the parties accountable and to give that seller comfort knowing that that earnest money is released to them and it's no longer earnest money. It's a non-refundable deposit, and that it's a credit to the buyer towards their whatever they were using it for, and it's no longer earnest money. So that provision is something that can be used to negotiate. So when you get to a point where you're like, okay, we're on extension number 2 or 3, and we represent the seller, and we want to make sure that the buyer is definitely going to understand that their earnest money is no longer earnest money. And the seller may need that money to go and pay for the moving trucks or go put money down on their new place, whatever that may be. That's how you have to negotiate that conversion of earnest money to a non-refundable deposit. That's that language. And you do need that language. If you want it, I can send it to you. Jerry Kay has also been instructed that she can give it to you when you need it. I've texted it to people before. I've emailed it to you. But that is the language, and you want to use exactly that language. Don't get creative on your own. That's where you get yourself into trouble. Next slide. The other reason 22Y, the reason you want to use a 22Y is because the delays of financing. Like I said earlier, if you have a lender who is not on board and you have to do an extension because of the 22Y, You may also want to send over, if you could flip to like, I think the second to last slide, the 22AR, Shannon, if you could do that, that would be great. So I could kind of show that. Yeah, the 22AR, if you have not delivered this notice and you're like on day, let's say you're day 30 and you're supposed to close on day 31, it's like, sometimes I kind of laugh. I got this from an agent that's representing a buyer on, actually it's a seller. We're representing the buyer and the sellers, this is like day 31. We're supposed to close tomorrow. Our financing was rocky. We represent the buyer and she sent this yesterday. Now, what this means is that she's doing a good job for her seller because, you know, she probably had a financing contingency date on the 22A and she has to send this per the contract, but the seller may terminate this agreement anytime 3 days after delivery of this notice. So in essence, we just got letter of loan denial today. So the buyer is going to basically get their earnest money returned to them, and we're going to deliver that notice before the 3 days is up. So the 22AR, some of you guys don't know how to use this correctly. And honestly, some of you need to start getting a bit more firm with how you counter 22A when you represent the seller. And we've covered that in previous calls. So I want to remind you that that 22AR, you know, that you have that 3 day period of time, that doesn't mean that the seller is going to get the earnest money. In that very instance, the buyer would send over the notice of loan denial, send over the 90I, and the earnest money gets refunded to the buyer. It's clearly stated in the 22A how that's done. So that's why you want to go back to the 22Y and do an extension. You might want to consider that we extend that the different dates. It says other dates. Maybe you change the 22A the removal, that could be changed. I've seen some savvy listing agents or buyer's agents change those other dates to reflect the change on the 22A on the notice. That also is a negotiable item on the other dates. But I did this one really to kind of give you an idea of how specific you need to be with those other dates. And like, for example, on the cash, the 22EF, it's a cash addendum. It says Form 22EF, Term 3, Line 29 to be evidence to seller on. That is an example of an other date that would need to be addressed. Otherwise, you run into problems where you would breach the contract potentially as a buyer because that you didn't evidence the funds. So you got to think about those things when you're using a 22Y. You might have extensions that there's financing contingencies, there's evidence of funds, there's appraisal challenges that you might run into. All of those other dates need to be referenced and make sure that you've protected your buyer or your seller when you are countering on a 22Y, or you are considering maybe a walkthrough that needs to be done prior to closing. Form 21, Term F, Line 79. Again, that exact language needs to be referenced. If you start to get creative and you write language in there, you are in essence modifying the contract as well as the closing date when you write in line 2 in that section of this contract. 22Y is a part of the contract when it's executed. So what I see a lot of you doing is, say your buyer's delaying on their cash, for example, they didn't get the funds from China that they needed. So they need an extension, not only on the evidence of the funds, but they also need an extension on the closing date. Anytime you execute a 22Y, hi, oh cute. Anytime you execute a 22Y on the say you represent the buyer and you send this over to the seller, you run the risk that the seller either will say, no, I don't want to sign the extension or the change in the contract closing date. And they may want to go with somebody else, a backup addendum, or somebody else that has been kind of circling around the property. You want to be very careful about who initiates a 22Y, especially when you have financing or you have cash evidence that's needing to be done per the contract, because it could be seen that you are asking for a change in the contract. And for example, you did not get evidence that they were changing the lender or the loan type that is required in the contracts. So be very careful that you execute the 22Y appropriately, that if you need help with that, you contact me or contact Jerry Kay or a managing broker that knows how to use the 22Y and has been well-versed in how to write some language here for you. It should not be done on your own if you have not dealt with these types of situations before. As you can see, the other dates, it's very specific about what those other dates need to be. So don't get creative and just write some dates on there. You need to be very specific. Before you even get to 22Y, you might want to consider, if you are running into problems, no more using 22FM. That's another plug. No more using 22FM. If a seller or a buyer is using it, cross it off and use some sort of automatic extension language. I'd much rather see you do this than to use a 22FM, which becomes very challenging to navigate in circumstances where COVID does not apply. Automatic extension language should be, if the sale fails to close by no fault of either buyer or seller, the parties hereby agree to automatically extend to closing date by 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. John L. Scott has an addendum where they actually have an automatic box checked on their addendum that says, if the sale fails to close by no fault of either buyer or seller, maybe a lender forgets to do the CD, maybe the escrow company is not able to get the seller or the buyer in for signings. Those are some types of automatic extension language that would apply with something like this. So if you wanted to use this, say I would not use the 10 days, that's quite long actually, but I would say a 2 or 3 day automatic extension into a contract would not be a bad thing. I would just be careful, because anytime you add this language in and you're up against multiple offers, you could run yourself into some problems with the seller not agreeing with this language, or having an issue with using a 22FM or using an automatic extension language in the contract. But it may help you if you're trying to work with the seller and they're concerned about COVID or worried about, the seller or the buyer or the escrow company they selected. This might be a good extension language to use. I would place it, it's long enough, you could put it right into 22D other or on a Form 34, but that would be some of the language you could use without having to adjust. Maybe you don't need the extension, the 22Y, maybe you're just trying to extend some things or make sure that the parties agree. That would be the way to do that. I've talked about 22AR, so we'll go to the next slide. The modification of closing, this is another example of the waiver of financing. So as we talked about with the AR, maybe you're not doing the AR, you're negotiating extension. Maybe you got a phone call, you're the seller, and you got a call from the buyer and saying, hey, not good. We just got, we're made aware of the appraisal not coming in, but we actually want to have your buyer waive the financing contingency. Again, this would be, maybe I have a backup offer. Again, you might have to use this type of language to keep the party, to remove their contingency. Again, if they remove their waiver of financing contingency, they may still have their appraisal contingency that's embedded into the 22A. But by this language, buyer hereby waives the financing contingency set forth in the financing addendum 22A. That could be as simple, all you have to do, even though you may have the 22AR been sent the notice and you're representing the seller. This might be how you would negotiate or get through that. And again, modification of closing date actually has a date in it. Many of you are getting creative and writing on or before or earlier or sooner or any of that kind of language, which the MLS and attorneys do not agree with. That's why they don't allow you to type that in when you use express forms or while you're adding things into your forms. Even Shannon, as she was preparing this addendum, could not add the on or before or before or language like that. The reason for that is because there are contingencies, like if we went back to the 22Y a couple of slides earlier, that says other dates, right? Other dates like walkthroughs, financing contingencies, earnest money, things that have to be delayed because of feasibility. There are probably about 10 or 11 different reasons why there are some other dates. And the reason why if you put on or before, some of those dates don't make sense. And it creates a lot of confusion for the parties. And so that's the reason not to use the or sooner or on or before. Now, if you've considered all of the other scenarios or possible scenarios and the parties agree, then escrow is going to honor the on or before, or the not require you to get another extension addendum or modification of closing date addendum. If you want to do that, just be careful, because if you do that, you're going to run into some problems with walkthroughs potentially, or contingencies passing, or things of that nature. So it is best practice not to use the on or before or the or sooner language when you're doing the 22Y. Even if you're using the you're using a Form 34. Now, a lot of you have asked me, well, what if the clients are like, I don't really need the release of the earnest money or the waiver of the financing. I just want them to pay. I want that buyer to pay for that late fee, or I want them to pay for the PITI, because I'm paying a mortgage, and because we're going to do a 2-week extension, I want the buyer to basically pay me per day. And so in that case, you would need to contact escrow to find out what the PITI would be, either the buyer or the seller. It doesn't really matter. Again, it's going to be close. It's going to run maybe $100 per day, $75, maybe $50. It depends on the purchase price or the mortgage amount. That PITI stands for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And so you would write this again into the 22Y other. Buyer agrees to pay blank per day starting on blank through blank to cover seller's PITI, or to cover buyer's PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. It's written just like this. Many of you have asked me for this type of language. This would be the language you would write on the 22Y instead of maybe the earnest money non-refundable. Or again, I wouldn't recommend this on like the first extension. Like I said, first extension, to kind of give people that, if it's a week or it's a few days, not a big deal. Sellers need to be more reasonable with everything that's going on. There are things that are out of our control, out of their control, and out of escrow's control. Or lenders have some challenges with, their employee got COVID, or the CD didn't go out on the time that it needed to go out. There are reasons why you might need a few days extension, but when we're talking about the second or the third extension, you need to start thinking about how do we negotiate and keep the deal together. And it might be as simple as a PITI extension. This would be the language you would use in that instance. Next slide. Delayed possession. This would be also another way to help in a situation where you're negotiating an extension. Is maybe we do a delayed possession, right? Where the sellers can stay in their property for a little bit longer, or the buyers start having possession and are paying for that possession, paying for that to happen. Depending on if you represent the seller or the buyer, you're talking about a 65A or a 65B. If it's longer than a month, I would recommend the parties get legal counsel to discuss an actual formal rental agreement that takes into account some of the nuances in the COVID challenges with eviction law and that type of thing. If it's a 65A or 65B, most of the time the parties are working towards leaving the property. And again, we're just dealing with moving dates, move in, move outs, and that kind of thing. And sometimes that's what we need to do to help the parties get to the finish line, is negotiating a 65A and a 65B. Again, it's referenced in the Form 21 or 28. It's referenced in that purchase and sale agreement that if the parties agree that the possession is not on the mutual acceptance date, that the parties agree to come to terms with a 65A or a 65B. It's already in the purchase and sale agreement. You just may need to prompt your party, your respective party, to go ahead and do that. So that kind of sums it up. And I talk really fast. I apologize for those of you where English might be a second language. I know that my English is very fast, but hopefully you can pick up the tidbits tonight and answer questions later. If there was anybody that had questions, if you want to put that in the chat, I do have a few minutes. I can answer a couple questions. Shannon?
Sure. So just going back to a brief mention on backup offers, how many people would you say are actually winning offers by being in backup position?
More than you would think right now. So when I talk with the top, actually, I've talked to 2 top producers from other companies, and they said that they are having to write, as we all know, having to write many more offers in order for them to get accepted. And they just put that in their wheelhouse where they're basically doing, one of them said 25% of the time I'm getting a backup addendum accepted. That's pretty good odds, 1 out of 4. And the other one, she didn't want to tell me that information, but she just says she's very proactive at making those phone calls and contacting those listing agents, because she says, and just like I experienced, if you went on a search on the MLS, you maybe, if you're lucky, see 1 out of 10 put pending backup, PB, most of the time. And that's I would say less than 10%. If you really did a search, most of them don't know that they can change that status to pending backup.
Right. So how many would you say on average transactions fall through? Like, what is kind of the potential where if we had a backup in place that we could pick it up? How many transactions fall through on average?
That's a great question. Most of the brokerages don't want to share their numbers, but in our brokerage, we're going to have anywhere from 15 to 25% of the deals fall apart for whatever reason. Earnest money didn't get deposited. Home sale contingency didn't go through. The feasibility was not satisfied. The inspection didn't go through. The financing was challenged. The buyers backed out for no reason. There are many reasons why a deal will fall through. We do a class on that. But that's 15 to 25% of the deals will actually fall through once they become mutual. So I think that those odds sound pretty good. When you're losing out on, say you write 4 offers or 5 offers and you don't get one accepted, why don't you throw your hat in the mix of maybe those odds and see if you get a backup accepted and get into position. I think it's worth a shot, especially in an inventory challenge marketplace.
Yeah. So as a listing agent, just so those that are listing properties right now and they understand kind of the implications of that, what are the requirements in terms of changing statuses on the MLS for pending backup to say pending, or
if they have a pending right now and they are feeling like that buyer's kind of going sideways on them, or maybe the inspection negotiation is not going so well, you can change it to pending backup right now. There's no harm in doing that.
Okay. And then it looks like we got a question from GC. I'm not sure who that is in terms of our brokers, but do we need to get seller permission if a buyer decides to go from 10 to 20% down to a 5% down? Yes. Not changing the loan type, just changing the down payment.
Yes, you do. And I wish that when they did that modification to that addendum, and what they're referencing, for those of you who are trying to kind of keep up with the forms, they're referencing the 22AC, Apple Cat. 22AC says that if you change lenders or loan types, that you must get approval from the seller, and both buyer and seller must initial that. They didn't put that down payment change, but it does, if you do not get permission from the seller to change it from 10 to 20 down to 5. Now, if you're putting more down payment, no need. But if it's less, then you jeopardize risking your client waiving their financing contingency without the seller's acceptance of that. So you do need to either send them a Form 34, and I wish they had it on 22AC. They do not. You could probably use the 22AC or just use a Form 34 and just make sure that the parties agree that the buyer will be, and you could just simply say, buyer and seller agree to the down payment on Form 22A, term 1 to be, and then change it from 10 to 5. That would be how you would write that, but it can be on a Form 34. Okay, awesome. Any other questions that you guys have? Covered a lot of ground today. Hopefully you got a few tips on the extension. And again, we're seeing a lot of extensions coming through. Not a bad thing. At least you guys are keeping the deals together. That's the good news. We're negotiating well too. Okay. Shannon, anything else on your side?
Nope, that's all for today.
That's a wrap. You guys have a great week, and don't forget Wednesday, we are going to do a 1-hour training on HomeBot. If you want to jump on for that, it's at noon. This is the Zoom meeting link for that training. If you have closed clients or you're wanting to use the free version of HomeBot, which is pretty impactful, my closed clients are loving that HomeBot. In fact, my graphic designer, Lori, she's like, set me up, Rochelle. Don't hold out on me. She's like, I want to be kind of up to date on all of the HomeBot stuff. So jump on it at noon on Wednesday if you want to learn more about that. And we'll go through that on that call. Have a great week, you guys. Talk to you soon.